There is a great deal of confusion about what you mean when you talk about freedom. It's very easy and very tempting to confuse freedom, as I use the word, or as I think you people would want to use the word, with wealth or power. Compare, for example, a citizen of the United States today and a citizen of the United States 100 years ago. There is no doubt that the citizen of the United States today has much more wealth on the average than the citizen 100 years ago. If, as some people do, you define freedom in terms of the range of alternatives available to a person, among which that person can choose, then you would have to say that people today are freer than they were 100 years ago. They have a much wider range of alternatives. But that is not a very useful definition of freedom because it confuses two very different things. Robinson Crusoe on an island by himself might be on a very rich island, and there might be a neighborhood Robinson Crusoe all by himself on a poor island. The Robinson Crusoe on a rich island would have a wider range of choices. He would have more alternatives open to him. The Robinson Crusoe on the poor island would have fewer. But there'd be no meaning to saying that one Robinson Crusoe is freer than the other. He's wealthier than the other, but he's not freer. And in the same way, as I shall develop more fully in a few minutes, the citizen of the United States today is wealthier than his counterpart 100 years ago, but he is by every dimension less free than he was 100 years ago. In the same way, in any individual society, a person who has a high income has a wider range of alternatives open to him than a person who has a low income. But are you going to say he's freer? No, he's wealthier. He may be more or less free. That depends on what? It depends on the extent to which he is subject to the coercion of other people. I define freedom, for my purposes, as referring to relations among people and as referring to the absence of coercion by other persons. And by coercion, I mean physical coercion or the threat thereof. I don't mean coercion through being a better arguer or through having more money with which to bid you away. I mean coercion by hitting you over the head or its equivalent. Now, there is, of course, no such thing as absolute freedom. In the famous phrase of a Supreme Court justice, my freedom to move my fist is limited by the proximity of your jaw. So that all freedoms are limited, and the limit is that a free society is one in which people are free to make any arrangements they want between themselves, so long as two conditions are satisfied. The first is that it's voluntary, and the second is that it does not affect, more particularly harm, third parties. See, we've got competition up here. Sabotage, yes. There must be a modern liberal as opposed to a classical liberal somewhere around. Now, if we're going to talk about the future of freedom, as Santayana's famous cliche tells us, we can best judge the future by looking at the past. And the past, if you look at it objectively and broadly, gives very little reason in the first instance for any optimism about the future of freedom. If you look at the history of the world over long periods of time, it's perfectly clear that the natural state of mankind is tyranny and misery. That free societies have been very rare, there have been very few of them, they've been very exceptional. It's hard to find any place in the world where you have had a free society over any long period of time, and at no time have more than a minority of the people ever lived in a free society. That's as true today as it has ever been before. We have been extraordinarily fortunate in having been born or having been able to migrate to a relatively free society. As I shall point out, less free than it was, but certainly free by comparison with most of the countries of the world. And therefore, we tend to underestimate the fragility of a free society and the difficulty of maintaining it. We think of it's not only that free societies have been rare, but they have been largely a result of accident rather than of any natural, predetermined forces. There is no natural force that leads to freedom. I have often thought that, using economic analogies, that it may well be that a free society is an unstable equilibrium position. A position which it can be, if achieved, can be maintained, but which, if slightly disturbed, will tend to move toward its opposite. I hope that's not right, and I think it need not be right, but it's not something that history lets us dismiss. But consider the question of how our own free society arose. In my opinion, the extent of freedom in our society owes an enormous amount to two accidents. The first accident is particularly appropriate to speak about today because tomorrow we celebrate the birthday of George Washington. He wasn't really born on February 16th, as you all know. That's a fake. That's a government fake. He was born on February 22nd, but because the Congress deemed that it was in the general welfare that it be celebrated on a Monday, we now celebrate it on whatever Monday falls nearest to that. Have you ever considered the fact that of the various revolutions that have taken place in the world, the United States Revolution, the American Revolution, is almost unique in having given birth to a free society? The Russian Revolution did not give birth to a free society. The French Revolution did not give birth to a free society. The Chinese Revolution did not, and you can go down. It's very hard to find any revolutions that did. Our own revolution almost went the way of all other revolutions. At the end of the Revolutionary War, when there was great dissatisfaction among the armed forces, and particularly the officer corps, because they hadn't been paid, a group formed a conspiracy. Among that group, I may say, was Alexander Hamilton, who was a very leading member of it. I have a great admiration for Alexander Hamilton as an intellect, and as having done a great deal to get the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. But I don't have much respect for his report on manufactures, which was an attempt to show that Adam Smith was wrong. At any rate, to go back to that story, because I think it's a fascinating story. This group of dissatisfied military officers wanted to set up a military junta to take over the country and run it so they could get their pay. And they wanted to have George Washington lead their junta. And it was only because of the personal character of George Washington, his resistance to the idea that he should become essentially a military dictator, but equally important, to the love which his troops bore for him and for his calling together a mass meeting and getting up and making a speech in which he urged them not to go that route. I may say there were other generals around who were only too willing to assume that task in the United States, and it was only because of those personal characteristics of George Washington that the United States did not go the way of the other revolutions and become a military junta. If you're interested in that story, it's a fascinating story. It's told extraordinarily well in James Flexner's biography of George Washington, which is a marvelous 4-volume book that reads like a novel. But there was a second, later accident that I think was equally important. In the 1820s, 30s, there was no ideological resistance in the United States to state socialism. On the contrary, one state after another was setting up a state bank. The state of Indiana had the Bank of Indiana. The state of Illinois had a state bank of Illinois. The various states were building canals, which were state-owned. They were setting up businesses, which were state-owned. There was a great emergence of essentially state socialism. Now, that wasn't eliminated or reversed by anybody writing a good book showing that it was all nonsense and that it didn't conform to Adam Smith. What ended it was that you had a financial panic in 1837 as a result of things I won't go into, need to say monetary influences. But you had a panic in which all of these state enterprises went broke. And that gave state socialism a bad name. And I have no doubt whatsoever that on any objective reading of history, that episode deserves a great deal of credit for the fact that for the rest of the 19th century, it was taken for granted that government had no business getting involved in producing goods and services, setting up banks and things like that. Obviously, there were still movements and attempts to do it. There were still activities of that kind, but it was largely a free society.